The brutal partition of Poland in September and early October 1939, carried out jointly by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, marked one of the darkest moments in Polish history. The once proud Polish armed forces were effectively shattered under the overwhelming onslaught of the German blitzkrieg from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east. Despite their bravery, the Polish defenders were crushed by sheer numbers, modern weaponry, and ruthless tactics. Yet even amidst the devastation, hope was not extinguished. 3 Polish destroyers and 2 submarines managed to escape the tightening noose and reach British ports, continuing the fight at sea under Allied command. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians refused to surrender to fate. Through incredible determination, they fled the occupied homeland, traveling through Romania, Hungary, and the Baltic states to regroup in Syria and France. By May 1940, approximately 84,500 Polish troops stood ready to rejoin the struggle against Germany, determined to reclaim their country's freedom on foreign soil. In those early days of exile, the Polish armed forces quickly became an integral part of the Allied war effort. An infantry brigade was dispatched to Norway as part of the multinational force defending the region from the German invasion. At the same time, 2 fully organized infantry divisions, 2 others still forming, and an armored cavalry brigade joined the defense of France. But despite their courage, the Allied lines once again crumbled under the fury of a second German blitzkrieg in 1940. The Polish formations, fighting bravely alongside French and British forces, suffered devastating losses. Like the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force, they were ultimately forced to retreat toward the coast and evacuate from continental Europe in June 1940. Only about 24,000 Polish troops succeeded in reaching the relative safety of Great Britain. They were soon joined by hundreds of Polish airmen who had already arrived earlier and were training to fight alongside the Royal Air Force in what would soon become the Battle of Britain, where Polish pilots would earn immortal glory for their valor and skill in defending the skies over England. The reorganization of the Polish military in exile took on new significance after June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. Realizing his need for allies, Joseph Stalin reluctantly recognized the Polish government in exile, led by General Stanisław Maczek, headquartered in London. An agreement was reached to form a Polish army within the Soviet Union, composed of thousands of Polish prisoners of war who had been languishing in Soviet camps since the 1939 invasion. This force, led by General Stanisław Maczek, trained under difficult conditions but grew steadily in size and determination. However, Stalin's mistrust of the Polish leadership remained, and in 1942, he agreed to transfer Anders' corps to British command. The unit, later known as the 2 Polish Corps, was evacuated through the Middle East, trained in Iran, and eventually deployed to Italy in December 1943. Fighting alongside British, American, and Canadian forces, the Polish soldiers distinguished themselves in one of the most grueling battles of the Italian campaign, the Battle of Monte Cassino, where their courage and sacrifice helped break the German defenses and open the road to Rome. Meanwhile, the Polish forces that had reached Great Britain were reorganized and stationed in Scotland as the I Polish Corps, forming a vital part of the British Isles' defensive forces during the darkest days of the war. The Corps was initially composed of 3 main units: the 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade, the 16th Armored Brigade, and the Independent Highland Rifle Brigade. Over time, these units were reinforced by volunteers from Polish communities across the globe, men and women who left behind their adopted homes to fight for the liberation of Poland and Europe. By February 1942, with the immediate threat of a German invasion of Britain receding, the British government granted permission for the creation of a fully fledged Polish Armoured Division. General Stanisław Maczek, who served both as Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces and Prime Minister of the government in exile, entrusted the command of this new division to General Stanisław Maczek. A veteran of World War I and the Polish-Bolshevik War of 1918 to 1920, Maczek was an experienced and deeply respected officer, though he had little prior experience with armored warfare. Nevertheless, he proved an inspirational leader, known for his tactical brilliance, his care for his men, and his unshakable spirit. His famous words became a rallying cry for Poles fighting abroad: The Polish soldier fights for the freedom of other nations, but dies only for Poland. Under leaders like Sikorski and Maczek, the exiled Polish forces would go on to play a pivotal role in the Allied campaigns of Western Europe, proving to the world that even without a homeland, the Polish spirit could never be conquered. The formation of the 1st Polish Armored Division marked a new and powerful chapter in the saga of Poland's exiled forces, a chapter defined by resilience, precision, and the unbreakable will to fight for freedom, even while far from home. Conceived under the command of General Stanisław Maczek, the division represented the culmination of years of reorganization, training, and determination among Polish soldiers who had escaped the fall of their homeland. Drawing on the remnants of pre-war Polish units and bolstered by volunteers from across the world, the division was structured to mirror the best British armored formations of the time. It initially consisted of 2 armored brigades, each containing 6 tank battalions, which were themselves formed from the experienced 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade and the 16th Armored Brigade. These were supported by a motorized infantry battalion drawn from the Independent Highland Rifle Brigade, a reconnaissance detachment, and a full complement of divisional support units including supply, ordnance, communications, medical, and engineering elements. Training for the new armored formation began in earnest in the open fields of eastern England, where the men practiced tactical maneuvers, live-fire drills, and large-scale coordination exercises with British and Canadian units throughout 1943. These sessions honed their skills and helped the Poles adapt to the Western style of mechanized warfare, a far cry from the cavalry and infantry tactics they had once used in the campaigns of 1939. General Maczek, always attentive to discipline and morale, emphasized realism and precision, ensuring that every soldier understood both the technical and psychological demands of armored combat. However, that same year brought significant organizational changes. The British Army's revised doctrine dictated that each armored division should include only 1 armored brigade, complemented by an infantry brigade to provide balanced combined arms capabilities. Though initially reluctant, the Poles complied with the new standard, reorganizing their units to meet British expectations while preserving their national character and esprit de corps. By early 1944, the 1st Polish Armored Division took on its final structure. The 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade became the primary armored component, consisting of 3 tank regiments, the 1st, 2nd, and 24th Lancers alongside a mechanized infantry battalion, the 10th Dragoons. The infantry component of the division was embodied by the 3rd Rifle Brigade, made up of the Highland, Podhalen, Rifles and the 8th and 9th Rifle Battalions. For reconnaissance, the 10th Mounted Rifle Regiment served as the division's eyes and ears on the battlefield, while 2 field artillery battalions, 1 anti-tank, and 1 anti-aircraft battalion provided critical fire support. Behind them, the division's supply, engineering, medical, and communications units ensured mobility and endurance across the fast-moving front lines. Altogether, the division boasted a formidable strength of 885 officers and 15,210 men, armed with more than 350 tanks, 48 field howitzers, 48 medium and heavy anti-tank guns, and 54 medium anti-aircraft guns. Every element of the division reflected a fusion of Polish determination and British military precision. Despite their readiness, the Polish tankers and infantrymen were not immediately called to action during the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, nor in the initial ferocious battles that followed in Normandy. For weeks, they watched from afar as their Allied comrades carved out a foothold in France. The Poles waited anxiously impatient to finally face the enemy who had destroyed their country nearly 5 years earlier. Then, at the end of July 1944, the long wait ended. The division received its orders to embark for the continent. From the ports of London and Southampton, men and machines rows of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and trucks emblazoned with the proud Polish eagle rolled aboard transports bound for France. The voyage across the Channel was largely uneventful, but the air was thick with anticipation and emotion. On July 30, 1944, the first elements of the 1st Polish Armored Division landed in France. The soldiers who stepped ashore were no longer refugees. They were an elite, battle-ready force eager to take vengeance on their conquerors. Their baptism of fire would come almost immediately, In Operation Totalize, the massive Allied offensive aimed at breaking out from the Normandy beachhead toward Falaise, where the German armies were attempting to regroup and escape encirclement. For the Poles, the coming days would test every lesson they had learned in training. They would soon discover that the wide fields of Normandy were not just another battlefield, they would become the proving ground of Polish valor and the stage upon which the exiled army would finally reclaim its honor. The British decoy mission became a sacrificial one. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's grand strategy for the Battle of Normandy was as bold as it was deliberate. The British and Canadian armies would engage and hold the bulk of the German armored divisions on the eastern flank, effectively becoming a massive decoy, while the Americans under General Omar Bradley would punch through the weakened western front and sweep across France. The plan was sound in its conception, but devastating in its execution for the British and Canadians, who would face the fury of the German war machine head-on. On the eastern front of the Allied lines, 14 German divisions, 7 of them armored and boasting nearly 600 tanks, faced Montgomery's forces. Meanwhile, the Americans to the west contended with only 9 German divisions, of which merely 2 were armored and equipped with a paltry 100 tanks. This imbalance was deliberate and deadly. In his memoir A Soldier's Story, General Omar Bradley would later reflect on this grim truth. When reckoned in terms of national pride, this British decoy mission became a sacrificial one, for while we tramped around the outside flank, the British were to sit in place and pin down Germans. It was a mission that demanded the utmost endurance and courage, for the British and Canadians bore the brunt of the fighting, drawing in and holding down the strongest German formations, so that their American allies could execute the decisive blow elsewhere. That decisive blow came on July 25, 1944, with the launch of Operation Cobra, the long-awaited American breakout from Normandy. The operation began with a shattering bombardment that tore open the German lines, allowing U.S. forces to surge forward. Within days, the success was undeniable. By August 1st, American troops had entered Brittany, forcing Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, the German commander-in-chief in the west, to send a desperate message to Berlin: the left flank has collapsed. The German front was disintegrating under the weight of Patton's tanks and Bradley's infantry. On August 2nd, the strategic town of Mortain fell, and the very next day, Bradley ordered General George S. Patton Jr. to halt further deep advances into Brittany, leaving minimal forces there, and instead drive eastward, toward the heart of France. The Allied momentum was unstoppable. Rennes fell on August 4th, and that same day, Montgomery issued a new directive that made the overall Allied objective crystal clear. The broad strategy of the Allied armies is to swing the right flank towards Paris and force the enemy back to the Seine. The trap was being set. Within 48 hours, Patton's fast-moving columns were racing toward Le Mans, threatening to encircle the German 7th Army. The Americans had cracked the German defenses wide open. Now it was time for the British, Canadians, and Poles on the eastern flank, those who had borne the weight of the decoy mission, to begin their own dramatic breakout toward Falaise, the key point in closing the German escape route. Another black August 8th for the Germans. The date August 8th carried a dark historical echo for Germany. Exactly 26 years earlier, on August 8, 1918, the British Army had launched its devastating offensive east of Amiens during the First World War, an assault so successful that General Erich Ludendorff would later call it the Black Day of the German Army in the history of the war. Now, in 1944, history was preparing to repeat itself. On the eve of a new offensive, Lieutenant General Henry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army, addressed his officers and declared with quiet determination that August 8, 1944, would become an even blacker day for the Germans. To carry out this momentous operation, Crerar entrusted the task to Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the 2 Canadian Corps. Simonds was a man of innovation and calculated boldness. Under his command were the battle-tested 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, along with the inexperienced but capable 4th Canadian Armoured Division. Reinforcements included the seasoned 51st Highland Infantry Division and the 33rd Tank Brigade from Britain. Among them was a newcomer to the Normandy front, the 1st Polish Armoured Division, fresh from England, eager to prove itself in the crucible of battle. Although they had yet to fire a shot in France, The Poles were destined to leave a powerful and lasting mark on the campaign, one written in courage and sacrifice. Symons, ever the tactician, refused to fight a conventional battle. His plan for the coming offensive Operation Totalize was unorthodox, daring, and risky. He would launch the assault at night, without the usual preliminary artillery bombardment, to preserve the element of surprise. To increase the mobility and survivability of his infantry, he devised a remarkable innovation. By removing the 105mm gun from the American-built M7 Priest self-propelled howitzer, he converted it into a heavily armored personnel carrier, an improvised vehicle that became known as the Kangaroo. These armored transports would allow troops to advance directly behind the tanks, protected from small arms fire and shrapnel, thus keeping up the momentum of the attack. Symons also planned to use the Royal Air Force's night bombers to saturate the flanks of the German defenses, while American medium and heavy bombers would pound deeper targets after dawn, as the armored spearheads drove forward. Such a complex operation required flawless coordination between air and ground forces and extreme precision in navigation, a formidable challenge in the chaos of war. On the night of August 6th, a full-scale rehearsal was conducted to test the viability of these daring tactics. The results were encouraging. Artillery units proved they could mark targets accurately with tracer and marker shells, guiding the bombers effectively. Other innovations were added to ensure accuracy in darkness: radio directional beacons, artificial moonlight, generated by searchlights bouncing off low clouds, and tracer fire from anti-aircraft guns to define the flanks of the advance. All was ready. The stage was set for a night of thunder and fire, when the Canadians, the British, and the untested Poles would storm into history, determined to make August 8, 1944, not only a black day for the German army, but the dawn of Allied victory in Normandy. The offensive planned by Lieutenant General Guy Symons began with high hopes but quickly encountered difficulties that would test even the best prepared Allied forces. His strategy was ambitious and complex. The plan called for powerful night bombing by the Royal Air Force to obliterate the flanking areas of May-sur-Orne, Fontenay-le-Marmion on the right and La Hogue, Sequeville-le-Campagne on the left, beginning precisely at 2,300 hours on August 7th. Following this, the infantry divisions were to seize key objectives such as Garcelles, the Cramesnil Spur, Saint-Aignan, Gomsnil, and the Caillouet features. Once those positions were secure, a heavy daylight bombardment would pave the way for the armored divisions to advance. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division was tasked with capturing Fontaine-le-Pin and Potigny, while the newly arrived 1st Polish Armoured Division would secure the vital terrain east of the Cannes, Falaise Road on the south side of the Lyson stream. Awaiting this massive assault was General Sepp Dietrich's ISS Panzer Corps. Though badly battered after 2 months of fierce combat, it still possessed around 100 deadly 88mm and 75mm anti-tank guns positioned in depth along the defensive line. At the stroke of 2,300 hours, the night sky over Normandy erupted with thunderous force as 1,020 RAF heavy bombers released 3,462 tons of explosives. The timing and precision were remarkable according to Canadian official history. Not a single bomb fell among friendly troops, although 10 aircraft were lost during the raid. Just 30 minutes later, at 2,330 hours, the ground assault commenced. The battlefield soon descended into chaos, with dust and smoke from exploding shells and advancing tanks creating near-total confusion. Yet, despite these challenges, Symons's new tactics proved effective. By dawn, the infantry had achieved their initial objectives, and by midday, the vital positions at Caillouet and Gomsnil were firmly in Allied hands. Remarkably, casualties were far lighter than expected, and spirits were high. The stage was set for Phase 2 of the operation, one that would see the 1st Polish Armoured Division play a critical role, beginning with their attack on the heavily defended village of Covecourt. However, success began to falter as complications arose. Weather reports predicted poor visibility, making it difficult for the daylight bombers to accurately locate their targets. As a result, the planned advance was postponed until 13:55 hours, disrupting the carefully timed coordination between ground and air forces. The delay proved costly, especially for the Polish units, who had been forced to travel a long distance from the bayou area during the night to reach their designated starting positions. Still, by early afternoon, the Allied formations were ready to move just as 678 American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses roared toward their objectives at 1,255 hours. The German defenders responded fiercely with intense anti-aircraft fire filling the skies, shooting down 9 B-17s. Out of the entire force, 181 bombers failed to release their payloads due to navigation and visibility issues, but the rest dropped a staggering 1,487 tons of bombs across 3 key target zones. Then tragedy struck. Due to critical errors in navigation and target identification, 2 bomber groups, each consisting of 12 planes, accidentally released their loads on friendly positions. The result was catastrophic. An estimated 315 Allied soldiers became casualties of friendly fire, among them 44 brave Polish troops. One of those killed was Lieutenant Colonel O.M. Inoix, the highly respected commander of the Polish Divisional Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment. The error cast a somber shadow over what had otherwise been a strong beginning to the operation. It was a harsh reminder that even the most meticulously planned offensives could falter under the unpredictable conditions of war. The Allies had seized ground, but the cost of progress was once again measured not only in miles gained but in lives lost. The Allied offensive that had begun with so much promise soon faltered as the battlefield descended into confusion and bloodshed. The 1st Polish Armoured Division, under the command of General Stanisław Maczek, was eager to prove itself in its first major engagement, but fate had other plans. At precisely 1,335 hours 20 minutes earlier than scheduled, the Polish troops began their advance across the start line. On the left moved the 2nd Armored Regiment, and on the right the 24th Lancers, both supported by companies of the 10th Dragoons, Motor Battalion. The operation was well coordinated on paper, but the realities of war quickly tore that order apart. According to the division's operational report, the 2nd Regiment came under intense fire from German positions roughly 2 kilometers southeast of St. Aignan by 14:25 hours, while the 24th Lancers were simultaneously targeted by heavy artillery. The exact toll of casualties was not recorded, but the resistance they met was far stronger than anticipated. By mid-afternoon, the situation had grown dire. At 1,520 hours, Polish officers reported that the 2nd Armored Regiment was pinned down and facing enemy tanks on its exposed left flank. Less than an hour later, at 1,610 hours, 2 Canadian Corps headquarters received a grim message from General Maczek. Around 20 German tanks believed to be formidable Tiger IIs, but almost certainly Panzer IVs, were covering with fire all over the country immediately over the lateral road running through St. Aignan. The Poles had unknowingly driven straight into a well-organized German counterattack. The enemy, part of Obersturmbannführer Hubert Meyer's 12th SS Hitlerjugend Panzer Division, was determined to halt the Allied advance at all costs. Later, Meyer would claim that the Polish 2nd Armored Regiment had lost 26 of the 38 Shermans in its 2 leading squadrons. Considering that the regiment was resupplied with 24 new tanks and crews the very next day, his estimate appears to have been tragically accurate. The Polish tankers had fought bravely, but they had been outflanked and outgunned. Meanwhile, the 24th Lancers faced an equally formidable challenge. As they pushed forward toward St. Aignan, their advance came to an abrupt halt before an unexpected obstacle, a shallow valley with a steep southern bank that made tank movement impossible. This depression, clearly marked on the 1944 Allied maps, had somehow been overlooked by the planners of the operation. The oversight proved disastrous. The Lancers' immobilized tanks became sitting targets for German artillery and for the Tigers counterattacking from the direction of Sinthos to the south. The German guns rained fire upon them, and the Poles paid heavily for the planners' error. German reports claimed that the Lancers lost 14 tanks in this action, and by the early evening hours, what remained of the Polish forces had been forced to withdraw to positions northwest of St. Aignan. The bravery of the Poles did not go unnoticed. British gunner Ken Tout, who served in a Sherman tank and would later become a respected military historian, recalled watching the Polish charge from a distance. "We could only watch," he wrote, admire the Poles' bravery, and be deeply saddened by the losses of our gallant allies. Later, British and Polish medical officers and orderlies tended to each other's wounded. His words captured the grim respect shared among the Allied soldiers who had witnessed the Poles' sacrifice on that blood-soaked day. But the Poles were not the only ones to meet fierce resistance. The Canadian troops on their left flank struggled as well. It was not until 1800 hours that they managed to clear the tiny hamlet of Gomsnil of German defenders, and there their advance came to a standstill. The grand armored push, envisioned as a decisive breakthrough toward Falaise, had turned into a costly and disappointing failure. The shattered terrain was littered with burning tanks, wounded men, and the remnants of a plan that had promised so much but delivered heartbreak instead. General Simons, the architect of the operation, was bitterly disappointed by the outcome. Still, the campaign was far from over. His new plan for August 9th aimed to renew the offensive. The Canadians would push toward Point 195, northwest of Potigny, while Colonel Tadeusz Majewski's 10th Polish Armored Brigade was to advance toward La Croix and seize Point 140 above the Lyson stream. The Allies had been bloodied, but their determination remained unbroken. The battle for Normandy was not yet done. The renewed Allied push on August 9th began under a cloud of confusion and chaos. At 0200 hours, the Canadians launched their long-awaited advance, but from the very beginning, things went terribly wrong. In the darkness and under the strain of combat, one of their armored infantry groups mistakenly moved off course and advanced toward the wrong target Point 140, which was, ironically, the Polish division's assigned objective. As their own war diary later dryly noted, high ground was sighted and we headed for it. The mix-up proved catastrophic. Surrounded by enemy forces and cut off from reinforcements, the trapped Canadians fought desperately for survival. The last radio transmission from the isolated group crackled in at 0849 hours, its message grimly cut short. When the battle finally subsided, only 4 officers, 44 infantrymen, and 5 tank crewmen managed to escape through enemy lines to reach the Polish positions by 0300 hours the following day. The rest had been killed or captured in what became a tragic episode of friendly confusion and German ferocity. The Polish advance that day began several hours later, at 1100 hours, as General Maczek's men pushed toward Soignols and La Croix. Leading the way were the swift Cromwell tanks of the 10th Mounted Rifles Armored Reconnaissance Regiment, whose mission was to probe ahead and locate enemy defenses. They soon reported that the village of Saint-Sylvain was firmly in German hands. Without hesitation, the 1st and 8th Infantry Battalions were ordered to clear the village, a task that would prove bloody and costly. Meanwhile, at 1250 hours, the main body of the division consisting of the 1st Armored Regiment and the 24th Lancers was advancing steadily. The 1st Armored Regiment reached the western outskirts of Covecourt, while the 24th Lancers took up positions astride a small wood about a kilometer to the southeast. Each formation was supported by a company of M10 tank destroyers, ready to counter the dreaded German Panthers and anti-tank guns that dotted the ridges ahead. But as the afternoon wore on, the Poles ran headlong into the storm. Hidden German 88mm and 75mm guns opened fire from well-camouflaged positions, and within minutes the battlefield was lit with the flames of burning tanks. Despite the deadly barrage, the 24th Lancers fought their way forward and by 1600 hours reached the outskirts of La Croix and the high ground near Point 111 west, while the 1st Armored Regiment maneuvered behind them toward Point 111 east, about 2 kilometers northwest of Rouvres. From these hard-won positions, Polish gunners sighted several tanks moving near their next objective, Point 140, and opened fire. Tragically, those targets turned out not to be German but Canadian. The confusion of war had once again struck, this time with deadly irony, as Polish shells rained down on their allies' positions. Meanwhile, German fire continued to exact a heavy toll on the Poles. One report estimated that 22 Shermans had been destroyed in the engagement, though the true figure may have been even higher. The battlefield was a scene of devastation, smoke, twisted metal, and the relentless crash of artillery. Facing mounting losses and with no clear path forward, the Polish tank regiments were ordered to fall back toward Covecourt to regroup. For the soldiers watching from Point 140, the scene was heartbreaking. A Canadian officer later wrote of how they cheered on the Poles' brave advance, only to watch in horror as tank after tank blew up and brewed before the disappointed gaze of the doomed garrison. The Poles' courage was undeniable, but the cost had been severe. Yet amid the chaos and loss, there was one flicker of success before nightfall. At 1930 hours, following a heavy aerial and artillery bombardment, the 1st Polish Highland Infantry Battalion fighting on the left flank launched a fierce assault on Saint-Sylvain. Their attack was swift and determined, and after hours of brutal close-quarters combat, the village finally fell into Polish hands by 2200 hours. Not content to stop there, the battalion pressed on and captured nearby Saint-Martin-de-Bois before midnight. Though the day had been marred by confusion, heavy losses, and tragic mistakes, the fall of Saint-Sylvain offered a small but vital victory, proof that even amid the inferno of Normandy, the Polish soldiers' resolve remained unbroken. The battle for Point 111 represented one of the most grueling and strategically significant episodes in the Allied drive toward Falaise. General Guy Simonds, commanding the 2 Canadian Corps, had laid out an ambitious plan for the coming day. The Canadians were to seize the high ground at Point 206, located just west of Potigny, and then push forward in an exploitation toward Falaise. Simultaneously, the 1st Polish Armoured Division, under General Stanisław Maczek, was tasked with capturing the heavily defended Point 140 and then advancing across the Lyson River to occupy the hills directly north of Falaise, east of the main highway. However, before any attempt could be made to cross the Lyson, it was absolutely crucial to clear the Cannae Woods, an area the Germans had transformed into the cornerstone of their defensive line. Maczek, a seasoned commander with a deep understanding of the battlefield, objected strongly when ordered to have his armored division clear the woods. His resistance would later be vindicated when a Canadian infantry division's attempt to take the woods ended in disaster: 165 casualties, including 44 men killed in action. Meanwhile, Colonel Marian Wieronsky's 3rd Infantry Brigade of the Polish Armored Division had been slated to advance from the Istries area. Yet, with the Cannae Woods still in enemy hands and German artillery and mortar fire intensifying, the planned assault was repeatedly delayed. Eventually, 2 Polish infantry battalions, supported by the 10th Mounted Rifles Armored Reconnaissance Regiment, moved forward toward Point 111, a modest but vital elevation that offered control of the surrounding terrain. The fighting was bitter and unrelenting. Under constant bombardment and sniper fire, the Poles clawed their way up the hill. By last light, they had finally established a foothold on the summit, but their victory came at a tremendous cost. The Germans later claimed to have destroyed 18 Cromwell tanks in the course of this brutal engagement, a testament to the ferocity of the defense and the price paid for every yard gained. On August 11th, as the situation around Falaise reached a critical juncture, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery issued a decisive directive that underlined both the precarious position of the German forces trapped in Normandy and the urgency of sealing the shrinking gap between Falaise and Alsace. His orders to the 1st Canadian Army were unambiguous: capture Falaise. This is a first priority, and it is vital it should be done quickly. The army will then operate with strong armored and mobile forces to secure Argentan. The message was clear: the encirclement must be completed before the Germans could slip away. However, despite Montgomery's call for rapid action, that same day General Simonds ordered his infantry divisions to relieve the armored formations, a decision that would slow the momentum of the attack. During the night, Canadian infantry units replaced the exhausted Poles holding Point 111, while Maczek's division was withdrawn to the Saint-Sylvain-Covecourt area, placed in Corps Reserve to rest and regroup. Reflecting on the ordeal, General Maczek later offered a sobering assessment of his division's early combat experience. From the commanding officer to the lowest rifleman or lancer, we had no experience in the art of armored warfare, he admitted. What experience we had gained in September 1939 in Poland and in June 1940 in France was now obsolete. Experience is not gained in a day, it grows with the passage of months and years. His words capture the reality faced by many Allied armored units in Normandy. Courage and determination often had to compensate for a painful lack of modern battlefield experience. By August 13th, the pressure from the top only intensified. Montgomery again urged the 1st Canadian Army to dominate the Falaise region, insisting that no German troops should be allowed to escape through the narrow corridors leading south. His orders were explicit. Once the high ground north and east of Falaise was secured, Simons's corps must push forward without delay to capture Trun, thereby tightening the noose on the encircled German forces. The struggle for Point 111 had been hard-fought and costly, but it marked a pivotal step in the closing of the Falaise Pocket, one of the decisive moments that would ultimately seal the fate of the German army in Normandy. Operation Tractable, an advance under smokescreen. Operation Tractable was conceived as a continuation of the Canadian drive to seize Falaise and close the gap trapping German forces in Normandy. In essence, the plan was much like that of its predecessor, Operation Totalize, featuring heavy aerial bombardment to soften German defenses before the ground assault. However, there was one key distinction. Tractable was to be launched in broad daylight, under the protective veil of massive smoke screens rather than the cover of night. The main assault was designed to fall east of the Falaise Highway, delivered by 2 immense armored columns, each representing an entire armored brigade. Following behind each of these spearheads were 2 infantry brigades tasked with consolidating and holding captured ground. Meanwhile, General Stanisław Maczek's 1st Polish Armoured Division was assigned a secondary but still crucial mission to follow up the assault and clear the Royal Air Force (RAF) target areas once the bombers had completed their deadly work. At 11:35 a.m. on August 14th, Canadian artillery began firing marker shells to signal the RAF bombers that the attack was about to commence. Moments later, 73 medium bombers unleashed their payloads on German positions dug in along the Lyson Valley, sending shockwaves through the enemy defenses. Just 5 minutes after the first explosions, the Canadian armored columns began to roll forward. By 11:47 a.m., the artillery began laying down a dense wall of smoke across the battlefield, obscuring the advancing tanks and infantry from German gunners. Yet, what was meant to provide cover soon added confusion. The Sherman tanks, already struggling with the rough, cratered terrain, found the Lyson River crossings treacherous and difficult to locate in the thick smoke. One squadron lost 11 out of 19 tanks simply trying to find a way across, their hulks left smoldering in the mud. Then, at 2 p.m., the sky above Normandy thundered with the arrival of 417 RAF Avro Lancasters and 352 Handley Page Halifaxes. They dropped a staggering 3,723 tons of bombs on the right flank of the advance. The devastation was immense, and most of the designated German positions were obliterated. However, the fog of war extended even to the skies. 77 aircraft bombed short, tragically hitting Allied troops instead of the enemy. The friendly fire caused 397 Canadian casualties and 93 Polish casualties, a grim reminder of how chaotic large-scale coordination could be under such conditions. By nightfall, the German defensive line along the Lyson had finally collapsed, their positions reduced to rubble and confusion. Yet, despite General Guy Simons's explicit orders for the armored columns to continue moving under cover of darkness, momentum was lost. Fatigue, disorganization, and miscommunication left the troops halted once more, giving the Germans precious time to regroup on the high ground north of Falaise. The 1st Canadian Army operational log for August 14th recorded a direct order from Field Marshal Montgomery to General Harry Crerar: take Falaise without delay. However, Montgomery's instruction carried one important caveat. The capture of Falaise must not hinder the more critical task of pushing southeast toward Trun, where a link-up with the advancing U.S. forces from the southwest would complete the encirclement of the German 7th Army. The slow Canadian advance. The following morning, August 15th, the Canadians renewed their advance, but progress was agonizingly slow. Despite the weakened and disorganized German forces ahead of them, the attackers found themselves bogged down in stiff resistance, confusion, and poor coordination. 2 tank battalions suffered heavy losses in their attempt to take Hill 159, and it took 160 casualties just to capture Point 168, southeast of Solangi. The town itself finally fell by 6:15 p.m., but a determined German counterattack soon drove the Canadians back out. By the end of the day, The exhausted infantry were right back where they had started, disheartened, battered, and frustrated. Meanwhile, on the Polish front, Maczek's men completed their assignment of clearing the RAF target areas, including the Kenay Woods, by the morning of the 15th. They then shifted toward the eastern flank, advancing through Rouvres and Mézières. The Germans, in retreat but still disciplined, managed to blow up the bridges over the Dives River at Vendouvre and Jort, forcing the Poles to improvise. By early evening, elements of the 10th Mounted Rifles Armored Reconnaissance Regiment, supported by a company of M10 tank destroyers and a motorized infantry company, managed to ford the river at Jort. They pushed onto the high ground east of the village, establishing a tenuous but vital foothold. However, tragedy struck when the 1st Armored Regiment, moving up to support them, mistakenly identified the Cromwell tanks of the 10th Regiment as German Panzer IVs. In the confusion, they opened fire on their comrades, causing casualties and damage before the mistake was realized. The Germans, observing the chaos, claimed that 3 Polish tanks were destroyed and 5 more damaged. Other attempts to cross the Dives River south of Jort and at Vendouvre failed, but during the night, the 9th Polish Infantry Battalion managed to wade through the river and establish a bridgehead, which they steadily expanded southward toward Baru and the eastern outskirts of Morteau-Koulabov. Despite this promising position, the Poles were ordered to hold their ground rather than advance. Turn, less than 20 kilometers away, lay within reach, but instead of exploiting the opportunity, the division was told to wait until relieved by Canadian infantry, a decision that would later be seen as a costly delay in the race to close the Falaise Pocket. On August 16th, General Simons issued new orders. The Canadians were to clear Falaise, while the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Armoured Divisions were to cross the Dives and advance southeast from Damblinville and Jort respectively. That afternoon, Montgomery personally phoned Crerar, warning him that the German divisions west of Argenton were preparing to break out between Turn and Falaise, making it absolutely vital to seize Turn and close the gap with the Americans before it was too late. By now, the German retreat was in full swing. Columns of men, vehicles, and horse-drawn wagons streamed eastward, desperately trying to escape the tightening Allied trap. The roads became choked with retreating soldiers and burning wreckage, presenting irresistible targets for Allied fighter bombers that swooped down relentlessly, turning the congested lanes into infernos of destruction. Soon, even artillery and tanks joined in the onslaught, pounding the trapped enemy. Yet, despite Montgomery's urgent directives, the advance of the 1st Canadian Army remained painfully slow, hampered by exhaustion, logistical challenges, and stubborn pockets of German resistance. The final assault on Falaise began at 3:25 p.m. on August 16th. The fighting raged through the rubble-strewn streets, with the Canadians battling house to house against desperate German defenders. By midnight, the northern part of the city had been secured, but fierce resistance persisted in the south. It was not until the early hours of August 18th that the battle finally ended, marking the long-awaited liberation of Falaise, a city shattered by war, yet symbolizing a turning point in the struggle for Normandy and the beginning of the end for the German army in France. Successes for the Poles. Amid the chaos of the final days of the Falaise Pocket, the Polish forces distinguished themselves with remarkable determination and skill. On the morning of August 17th, at 9:30 a.m., the 10th Mounted Rifles Armored Reconnaissance Regiment reported a massive German column moving east along the Croce, Trun Road, reflecting the desperate and disorderly retreat of enemy forces. German formations of all kinds, tanks, trucks, and even horse-drawn carts, attempted to flee northeastward, creating a chaotic and fragmented front. Yet even in this tumult, the Poles were not without their own losses. One reconnaissance squadron moving toward Trun lost 4 Cromwell tanks in under a minute to intense German anti-tank fire near Point 107, just 2 kilometers north of the town. The sudden loss forced the 10th Mounted Rifles to halt for the night northwest of Louviers, consolidating their positions while preparing for the next phase of the advance. Meanwhile, 2 Polish battle groups were assigned critical objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Stanisław Kossucki commanded a group comprising the 2nd Armored Regiment, the 8th Infantry Battalion, and a company of anti-tank guns, with orders to seize the imposing and heavily forested Point 259. Simultaneously, Major Władysław Gorzelski, commanding the 24th Lancers, the 10th Dragoons, Motor Battalion, and an accompanying M10 anti-tank company, was tasked with capturing the adjacent hills, roughly 2 kilometers south of Grand Mesnil. The attacks began in the late afternoon. Kossutzky's forces struck point 259 at 5:45 p.m., whilst Gorzelski advanced against the hills to the north. By 10:45 p.m., both objectives had been successfully secured, and the remainder of the 1st Polish Armoured Division moved forward to consolidate their positions during the night, solidifying a crucial foothold in the eastern sector of the Falaise Pocket. The significance of these actions did not go unnoticed at the highest levels of Allied command. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, keenly aware of the strategic opportunity to close the German trap, personally phoned General Crérar's headquarters early that afternoon to demand more aggressive action. The 1st Canadian Army War Diary records his message: "It is absolutely essential that both armored divisions of 2 Canadian Corps close the gap between 1st Canadian Army and 3rd U.S. Army. 1st Polish Armored Division must thrust on past Trun to Chambois at all costs and as quickly as is possible." Despite the urgency, the Allies were still plagued by delays. It would take another 48 hours before the 10-kilometer gap could be fully closed, allowing the final envelopment of the German forces. The Canadians, for reasons not fully explained, stopped for the night upon reaching Louviers, planning to attack Turn the next day, giving the Germans a temporary reprieve. Even as these tactical delays occurred, the Germans presented an unparalleled target-rich environment for Allied forces. RAF reconnaissance reported extraordinary concentrations of vehicles estimated at 2,200 or more, including convoys so dense that counting was impossible. The skies above Normandy were alive with Allied activity, with aircraft of the RAF's 35 Wing flying a staggering 2,029 sorties on August 17 alone. By the morning of August 18, the bulk of the German 7th Army had managed to cross the Orne River, with many support and supply units already east of the Dives. Yet despite these partial successes, a significant portion of the enemy remnants of 13 divisions remained trapped inside the pocket, their retreat far from complete. The Poles, through aggressive maneuvering and precise coordination, had positioned themselves as a spearhead of the Allied push, ready to exploit weaknesses in the German line and play a decisive role in the eventual closure of the Falaise Pocket. Their actions on August 17 not only demonstrated tactical skill but also highlighted the determination and resilience of a force long exiled from their homeland, now returning to the front lines of Europe to exact retribution on the occupiers of Poland. Allied advance on the 18th. The combined Canadian and Polish advance on August 18 unfolded on the eastern side of the Dives River, marking a critical phase in the closing of the Falaise Pocket, yet the progress achieved that day was frustratingly limited. Despite urgent orders from higher command to push rapidly and link up with American forces at Chambois, the maximum penetration made by Allied units barely reached 10 kilometers. Lieutenant General Guy Simons issued directives that afternoon for 1 Canadian Infantry Division to secure the east bank of the Dives down to Trun, while the armored divisions including the Poles were to continue their thrust toward Chambois. In practice, however, coordination between the Canadians and the Poles appears to have been minimal. At the unit level, neither side had a clear understanding of the other's movements, intentions, or progress during the crucial days of August 18 to 20th. Leaving gaps that German forces could exploit. Many intermediate Allied commanders mistakenly assumed the battle was almost over and that only mopping up operations remained, creating an operational lethargy that allowed thousands of Germans to escape and fight another day. The farthest penetration on the 18th was accomplished by a squadron of the Polish Armored Reconnaissance Regiment, which moved through Borden and reached the area immediately north of Chambois. Upon finding the town strongly defended and realizing no other Allied units were in immediate proximity, the squadron was ordered to withdraw to point 259. Similarly, a Canadian Armored Reconnaissance Squadron reached the northern outskirts of St. Lambert-sur-Dives around 1900 hours, only to lose 2 tanks to German fire by 2000 hours and, for lack of coordination with infantry, was forced to delay further action until daylight on the 19th. This delay allowed German forces to use the bridges in the village unopposed during the night. Remarkably, a full Canadian Armoured Brigade, which had moved to the Trun-Vimoutiers road north of Nofi by midnight, was held inactive in a counterattack role despite the absence of a coherent German defense in the area, highlighting the Allied hesitations and missed opportunities. For the Polish forces, the situation was similarly complicated. According to the 1st Polish Armored Division operational report, General Maczek, stationed at Normandy, had issued an order for the Kossutski battle group to strike immediately at Chambois at 1930 hours on August 17. Lieutenant Colonel Kossutski later recalled receiving the order during his ongoing attack on Point 259, but he elected to delay movement until fuel and ammunition arrived. By the time the advance was set to commence at 0200 hours on August 18, supplies had still not reached the forward units, creating a critical delay. The terrain through which Kossutski's forces were to advance was hilly, broken, and crisscrossed with narrow, twisting roads, interspersed with scattered farms and few villages. Even today, with modern maps and daylight, navigation through the Og countryside is challenging, making it no surprise that Kossutski employed a local French guide to lead the vanguard. The 2nd Armored Regiment, carrying the 8th Infantry Battalion mounted on Shermans, set off from Point 259 along the correct route and initially engaged a German column of motorized and horse-drawn transport, inflicting significant losses. The Shermans then pushed southeast toward Chambois. However, after crossing the main road and negotiating a steep hill that caused difficulties for several vehicles, the regiment inadvertently veered northeast, ending up at Les Champeaux, approximately 10 kilometers north of Chambois and far from the intended objective. Some have speculated that the similarity between the names Champeaux and Chambois may have contributed to the misdirection, though documentation from Headquarters No. 4 Liaison, 21st Army Group attached to Maczek's command confirms that Chambois and the high ground to its northeast were indeed the clearly stated objective. This navigational error, compounded by delays in supply and the difficulties of nighttime, fog-shrouded terrain, meant that despite determined effort, the Polish advance fell short of its goal, illustrating the logistical and operational challenges that plagued the Allies even at this late stage of the Normandy campaign. 3,057 sorties in one day. Les Champeaux, a tiny hamlet perched on the slope of a steep hill, consisted of little more than a small church and half a dozen scattered houses. For the Polish forces, however, its strategic significance was amplified by the proximity of Hostelry-Ferrault, a larger village located a few hundred meters to the northwest along the main Trun-Vimoutiers road, which was still occupied by German forces and being used as a key escape route. The clash between the Poles and the Germans was sharp, with casualties mounting on both sides. Compounding the difficulties, fuel had become a critical necessity. While waiting at Les Champeaux, Kossutski's battle group suffered additional losses when it was mistakenly struck by American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, who were targeting German columns on the road above them. Isolated behind enemy lines, under fire, harboring wounded soldiers, and unable to maneuver, the battle group found itself in a desperate situation. According to the 1st Polish Armored Division operational report, the condition of the battle group at this time was described as grave, prompting the deployment of the 1st Highland Infantry Battalion to assist. Maczek's headquarters later reported that half the petrol being sent to the 2nd Armored Regiment was destroyed through bombing just after 1700 hours, further hampering mobility and firepower. Despite these setbacks, General Maczek, renowned for his exceptional eye for vital terrain, made a crucial decision to block the exits from Chambois by seizing key points on Mont Ormel, specifically Point 137 near Couthard, and Points 262 North, 252, and 262 South, positioned astride the main Chambois-Vimoutiers road. On August 18, the Zgorzelski and 1st Armored Regimental battle groups were ordered to advance and by 2300 hours had successfully blocked the Trun-Vimoutiers road, securing the high ground on either side of Ecorches and effectively linking the Polish forces at Les Champeaux with the Canadians near Nofi. The division's operational report notes that the Polish battle groups were heavily engaged with German infantry and anti-tank guns, while Allied air attacks hampered the 1st Armored Regiment from fully capturing Borden. Between crossing the Dives River on August 16 and the end of August 18, the division suffered an additional 72 killed and 119 wounded, highlighting the heavy toll of this intense three-day engagement. The battlefield near Trun had by now become a horrifyingly vivid tableau of retreat and chaos. An Allied artillery observer described the scene in detail. The floor of the valley was seen to be alive, men marching, cycling and running, columns of horse-drawn transport, motor transport, and as the sun rose, so more targets came to light. It was a gunner's paradise, and everybody took advantage of it. On our left was the famous killing ground, and all day the roar of typhoons went on, with fresh columns of smoke obscuring the horizon. We could just see one short section of the Argentan-Trun road, some 200 yards in all, where at one point the entire miniature picture of an army en route unfolded. First a squad of men running, overtaken by men on bicycles, followed by a limber at a gallop, and all of this being overtaken by a Panther tank crowded with men, moving up to 30 miles per hour, all with a single aim of getting away as fast as possible. On that single day, Allied aircraft flew an astonishing 3,057 attack sorties, turning the valley and surrounding roads into a scene of relentless destruction and marking August 18th as one of the most intense days of aerial and ground combat in the closing operations of the Falaise Pocket. Corridor of Death. On the night of August 19th, SS Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser, commander of the German 7th Army, issued orders for a final breakout from the tightening Falaise Pocket. The plan was to link up with a counterattack coming from outside the pocket by elements of the 2 SS Panzer Corps, specifically the 2nd and 9th SS Panzer Divisions. The Germans were instructed to use the St. Lambert sector as their primary withdrawal route, with a main crossing of the Dives River positioned at Moissy, halfway between St. Lambert and Chambois. This stretch of road would soon earn the grim and unforgettable moniker the Corridor of Death, a name that reflected the deadly mix of artillery, aircraft, and Allied fire that awaited the retreating German columns. Meanwhile, the Allied trap was steadily closing, though far slower than it should have. At 1,100 hours on the 19th, General Simons issued orders assigning responsibilities along the Dives. One Canadian infantry division was to strengthen its lines and seal all escape routes. A Canadian Armoured Division was to cover the river from Trun to Moissy, while the Poles were tasked with the stretch from Moissy to Chambois and Point 262, south. Despite these clear instructions, the reality on the ground fell far short of expectations. No Canadian or Polish infantry were placed on the critical sectors of the Dives, a major oversight that allowed German forces to exploit the gaps. Compounding the problem, a Canadian armored brigade northeast of Trun remained inactive for much of the day. At Simons's insistence, and over the objections of the brigade commander, it was held as a potential exploitation force for a projected advance toward the Seine, only being redirected toward Vimoutiers in the evening. Even so, some significant action had already begun before the Corps commander's new orders reached the units. At 0635 hours, a company of Canadian tanks, supported by a weak infantry company and 4 17-pounder self-propelled anti-tank guns, mounted an attack on St. Lambert. Fighting was fierce, and after 6 hours, only half the village had been cleared. Reinforcements arrived later in the day, 2 additional infantry companies and 8 more anti-tank guns, but the Canadians still could not secure the southern portion of the village. Despite this, they held their ground, fending off repeated German counterattacks, and the group's commander, Major David Curry, was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary leadership and bravery. Simultaneously, another Canadian tank company advanced to Point 124, 2 kilometers east of St. Lambert, intending to link up with Polish forces operating in the area. Following General Maczek's orders, the Zgorzelski battle group captured Point 137 near Koudhard by midday. Meanwhile, the 24th Lancers advanced south toward Ferny, and the 1st Polish Armored Regiment, accompanied by the 9th Infantry Battalion and a company of anti-tank guns, moved toward the main Chambois-Vimoutiers road at points 262 north and 252, 5 kilometers northeast of Chambois. This road had become the Germans' primary escape route. When the leading Polish tanks arrived shortly before 1,600 hours, they found the road crowded with a chaotic mix of motorized and horse-drawn transport, along with 2 Panther tanks, one being towed by the other. In a short but intense engagement, the Polish forces destroyed the Panthers and obliterated everything else in sight. 1 infantry company, along with some anti-tank guns, occupied Koud-Hardboyschows, 700 meters to the northwest, while the Shermans and remaining infantry and anti-tank units took up positions on Point 262 north. By the end of this action, the Chambois-Vimoutiers road was completely blocked, littered with destroyed vehicles and the bodies of both men and horses, sealing the fate of any remaining German forces attempting to flee the pocket. This day would be remembered not only for the tactical skill and bravery displayed by the Polish armored units, but also for the devastating efficiency of Allied firepower, which transformed the once open escape routes into a deadly gauntlet, earning the corridor its infamous title. The view from the top of Maksuga. By 10:30 hours, the Kossutski battle group, which had been operating in the Les Champeaux area, had finally been resupplied, allowing it to resume its advance. Soon after midday, the group set off toward Point 262 north, and by 1700 hours, it had successfully established defensive positions on both the north and east sides of the feature. While this maneuver transformed Point 262 north and Koud-Hardboyschows into formidable Polish strongholds, Point 262 south remained unoccupied, leaving a significant gap in observation and control. The position on Point 262 north, often referred to as Mont Ormel after the nearby hamlet, was affectionately nicknamed Maksuga by the Poles, the mace reflecting the contours of its summit. From this elevated vantage, the Polish forces could survey large portions of the Falaise Pocket, gaining a strategic overview of the retreating German formations. However, the spectacular views belied the true tactical difficulty of controlling the surrounding terrain. Point 262 south and its foothills obscured observation toward the southeast, while the steep slopes, interspersed woods, and dense hedgerows made it exceedingly difficult to dominate the west and southwest using direct fire weapons during the day, and effectively impossible at night. The Germans, particularly the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, attempting to escape from the St. Lambert and Moisy crossings, were funneled through the Koud-Hard area and Point 137 on the western side of Mont Ormel. Despite controlling only the immediate vicinity, the Polish force comprising over 80 tanks, approximately 20 anti-tank guns, and 1,500 infantrymen presented a major, if not decisive, obstacle to the German retreat within a perimeter of less than 2 square kilometers. Their presence effectively blocked key escape routes, even if they could not dominate the entire landscape. The Poles faced additional challenges. They were physically cut off from higher command. General Maczek's divisional headquarters lay 8 kilometers to the northwest on Point 259, while Colonel Majewski's 10th Armored Brigade was stationed 3 kilometers west at Borden. In these conditions, Lieutenant Colonel Zygmunt Szydlowski, the senior officer on site, assumed command of the encircled force. A critical concern was the severe shortage of supplies. Isolated behind German lines, the unit could not access ammunition, fuel, or rations. Despite urgent appeals for aerial resupply, conveyed to Corps HQ by the British No. 4 Liaison Unit, the response was disheartening. No resupply could be arranged before August 21th, leaving the Poles to hold their precarious but vital position with whatever resources were at hand. Despite these constraints, Maksuga would remain a linchpin in the Allied effort to close the Falaise Pocket, demonstrating both the bravery and resilience of the Polish forces under extreme conditions. The Allies' encirclement weakens. By 1900 hours on August 19th, the Polish 24th Lancers had advanced their Sherman tanks to a strategic blocking position approximately 1,500 meters northeast of Chambois, where they successfully linked up with the 10th Mounted Rifles Armored Reconnaissance Regiment and 2 M10 anti-tank companies, which had by then reached Point 113, roughly 1 kilometer north of Chambois. This coordinated advance created the impression that the encirclement of the German forces in the Falaise Pocket was tightening. The most striking move of the day occurred at 1930 hours when the Polish 10th Dragoons, having moved south from Point 137, entered Chambois itself and soon afterward linked up with the 2nd Battalion of the American 359th Infantry Regiment. On the surface, it seemed that the noose around the retreating German forces had been drawn tightly, yet the reality on the ground was far more complex and less decisive than it appeared. At the strategic level, there was a serious lack of coordination between the 2 wings of the Allied armies and within Simons's 2 Corps itself. Despite the link-ups in Chambois, No Allied troops physically occupied the 5-kilometer stretch of the Dives River between Magny and Moissy, which in places could even be crossed on foot. Vehicle crossings at Magny, St. Lambert, and Moissy remained largely open, even though they were subjected to intermittent indirect fire. This gap in the encirclement provided the Germans with a crucial avenue of escape, undermining the Allies' apparent advantage. The situation was further complicated by the movements of the French 2nd Armoured Division, which had advanced to Ferny and the Chambois-Vimoutiers road by early evening but was then withdrawn south of the Dives as night fell. Its commander's attention had shifted to a more enticing objective, the liberation of Paris, leaving the region north and northeast of Chambois far from sealed. Consequently, the so-called trap was incomplete, and many German units retained avenues to retreat. Air support, although formidable, was also limited in its effect. Allied aircraft flew 2,535 sorties on the 19th, but the difficulty of accurately identifying targets in such a chaotic and fragmented battlefield meant that air operations had to be redirected farther east, toward the Seine River and its approaches, leaving significant portions of the Falaise Pocket still vulnerable to German withdrawal. This combination of coordination failures, tactical gaps, and strategic missteps ensured that, despite impressive advances, the encirclement was not yet secure, allowing thousands of German soldiers and vehicles to escape to fight another day. The bloody defense of Macsuga. On August 20th, the Allied forces made few significant moves, as attention focused on the precarious situation at Mont Ormel, or Macsuga, as the Poles had nicknamed it. The Polish plan to expand their bastion by seizing Point 262 south was abruptly cancelled due to intense German counterattacks on their perimeter and the severe losses incurred in attempts to deliver urgently needed supplies to the beleaguered garrison. The Poles on Macsuga were now facing a desperate situation. They had been under heavy artillery and mortar fire ever since their arrival the previous day, but the intensity of attacks increased as they were assaulted both from inside the Falaise Pocket by retreating German forces and from outside by elements of the 2 SS Panzer Corps. The primary attack from outside began at 0400 hours along the north side of the Vimoutiers, Trun Road, while simultaneously a second assault involving 21 German tanks struck the south side of the perimeter. The ferocity of the German attack was immediately apparent. In one harrowing episode, 5 Shermans of the Polish 1st Armored Regiment were destroyed in as many minutes by a single Panther tank firing from Point 239, roughly 1,500 meters to the north. As the day progressed, the Poles struggled with dwindling supplies and an inability to evacuate wounded or prisoners. By 1700 hours, the Germans had breached the northern part of the Macsuga perimeter, forcing a desperate counteraction that finally expelled them by 1900 hours, but not without the loss of 3 medium tanks. Meanwhile, German forces had managed to open another potential escape route along the east side of the Vimoutiers, Chambois Road, moving through Servais and Saint-Pierre-la-Rivière around 1,530 hours. This threat prompted the Poles to reinforce their motorized infantry in Chambois with tanks from the 24th Lancers, highlighting how tenuous the Allied control of the pocket remained. Early on the 21st, the Polish Armored Reconnaissance Regiment attempted to link up with the main force on Macsuga, but was mistakenly fired upon by friendly units, suffering damage to 2 Cromwells before withdrawing. The last German assault on Macsuga came at 1,100 hours from the west and was again repelled, but the Pole situation had become critical. Most Shermans were nearly out of 75mm ammunition, several were immobilized due to fuel shortages, and the infantry was exhausted, hungry, and low on water. Relief finally arrived at 1,330 hours in the form of advancing Canadian units. Beginning their advance at 0800 hours, the Canadians lost 4 tanks en route but claimed to have destroyed 4 enemy tanks and 2 self-propelled guns. Their war diary vividly described the scene at Mont Ormel as the grimmest the regiment has so far come up against. The Poles had had no supplies for 3 days. They had several hundred wounded who had not been evacuated. About 700 prisoners lay loosely guarded in a field. The road was blocked by burned-out vehicles, both our own and the enemy's. Unburied dead and parts of them were strewn about by the score. The Poles cried with joy when we arrived, and from what they said I doubt if they will ever forget this day and the help we gave them. The bitter fighting on Maksuga had taken a heavy toll. The Polish forces suffered 351 casualties, killed and wounded, and lost 11 Shermans, yet their resolute defense held a critical segment of the Falaise Pocket, delaying German escape and contributing decisively to the eventual Allied victory in Normandy. Closing the Falaise Gap. By 2000 hours on the final day of the battle, Canadian tanks had reached point 262 south, while other units secured the northern outskirts of Chambois, effectively closing the Falaise Gap and bringing the last major battle of Normandy to an end. The encirclement of the German forces was complete, marking a decisive moment in the Allied campaign. In November 1945, when addressing the men of the 1st Polish Armoured Division, Field Marshal Montgomery famously, if somewhat hyperbolically, proclaimed, "The Battle of Chambois was decisive. The Germans were trapped as if in a bottle. You were the cork in that bottle," a statement that highlighted the crucial role played by the Poles in sealing the pocket. Official Canadian records indicate that the 1st Canadian Army suffered 12,659 casualties between August 1 and 23, 1944, including 7,415 Canadians, 1,374 Poles, and 3,870 British. General Maczek later estimated Polish casualties from August 8 to 22 at 1,441 officers and men, a grim figure reflected in the over 700 Polish graves at the military cemetery in Erville-Langannery, situated roughly halfway along the Cannes-Falaise road. Equipment losses were also severe, with 66 tanks and 10 anti-tank guns destroyed during this period, illustrating the high cost of holding and advancing through the fiercely contested pocket. The 1st Polish Armoured Division continued fighting through northern Germany, ending the war in the Wilhelmshaven area after 283 days of continuous combat. Total casualties for the division are estimated at over 5,300 killed and wounded, while tank losses were catastrophic: 265 Shermans, 51 Cromwells, and 24 Stuarts, amounting to nearly the division's entire armored complement. The bravery and effectiveness of the division were recognized through numerous awards, including 1 Commander's Cross, 6 Gold Crosses, and 349 Silver Crosses of the Virtudi Militari, as well as 16 British Distinguished Service Crosses, 21 British Military Crosses, 5 British Distinguished Conduct Medals, and 27 British Military Medals. Despite these remarkable achievements, the Poles faced profound injustice after the war. Shockingly, no representatives of the 1st Polish Armoured Division were invited to the Victory Parade in London in June 1946, as the post-war Labour government prioritized maintaining diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union over acknowledging Polish contributions. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 had redrawn Eastern European borders, ceding 1/3 of Polish territory to the Soviet Union, and the newly installed communist government in Warsaw compounded the injustice. On September 6, 1946, General Maczek and 75 other Polish officers were stripped of their nationality, and by the spring of 1947, Britain withdrew recognition of the Polish government in exile in London. Polish forces under British command were demobilized and encouraged to return to a homeland now dominated by a regime that considered them traitors, despite the later amnesty. Returning soldiers, particularly officers, were often treated with suspicion and persecution. To provide a legal framework for those who refused to return to Communist Poland, the British established the Polish Resettlement Corps, where former soldiers received English language training and vocational skills for civilian life. Eventually, many were allowed to settle in Britain or other Commonwealth countries, building new lives far from their homeland. In sum, the story of the Polish armed forces during and after the war is one of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. They helped to win the war but lost the peace, earning glory on the battlefield only to be denied recognition and justice in its aftermath.